The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk of Maple Street as 73-year-old Robert Bobby Martinez sat on his front porch steps. His weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work and old shrapnel scars for Vietnam, carefully adjusted the small American flag he placed beside his coffee cup every morning. It was a ritual he had maintained for over 20 years, ever since he moved to this quiet neighborhood after his wife passed away. Bobby's modest house stood out among the newer constructions that had sprouted up around it. The paint was peeling in places, and the wooden steps creaked under his weight, but it was home. More importantly, it was paid for with his disability benefits and the small pension he received from his 40 years working at the local factory after returning from the war. Neighbors had grown accustomed to seeing the old man in his faded Marine Corps t-shirt, sitting quietly with his morning coffee. Some would wave as they hurried to work or school. Others would stop to chat about the weather or share neighborhood gossip. Bobby appreciated these small interactions, though he rarely initiated conversations himself. The war had left him with what doctors now call PTSD, though back in his day, they just called it soldier's nerves. This particular Tuesday morning felt different somehow. There was tension in the air that Bobby could not quite identify. Maybe it was the way Mrs. Henderson next door had quickly averted her eyes when he waved, or perhaps the unusual number of police cruisers that had been patrolling the area over the past few days. Something was stirring in his quiet corner of the world. The neighborhood had been changing rapidly over the past 5 years. Property values were rising as developers moved in, buying up older homes to tear down and replace with modern constructions that sold for 3 times what the original houses were worth. Bobby had received several offers for his property, each more aggressive than the last. Real estate agents would show up unannounced, presenting glossy brochures and promises of easy retirement money. He politely declined each time, explaining that this was his home and he had no intention of leaving. What the agents did not understand, and what Bobby found difficult to explain, was that this house represented more than just shelter. It was where he had brought his bride after the war, where they had planned to raise children before learning that particular dream would never come true, and where he had cared for her during her final battle with cancer. Every creaking board and faded photograph held memories that no amount of money could replace. As Bobby sipped his coffee, he noticed a small crowd gathering at the end of his street. City workers in bright orange vests were setting up barriers, and what appeared to be a surveyor was taking measurements. His stomach tightened with a familiar anxiety that he had learned to recognize over the years. Something official was happening, and in his experience, official activities rarely brought good news for people like him. The first sign of real trouble came when a black sedan pulled up in front of his house around 10 o'clock. 2 men in expensive suits emerged, carrying briefcases and wearing expressions that Bobby recognized from his encounters with military brass decades ago. They approached his porch with the confident stride of people accustomed to getting their way. "Mr. Martinez?" The taller of the 2 men called out, not waiting for Bobby to respond before continuing. "I'm David Thornton from Pinnacle Development Corporation, and this is my associate, James Weber from the City Planning Department. We need to discuss your property." Bobby set down his coffee cup and studied the men carefully. Thornton had perfectly styled hair and a watch that probably cost more than Bobby's monthly income. Weber kept checking his phone and seemed impatient to get the conversation over with. Neither man offered to shake hands or showed any of the basic courtesy that Bobby remembered for better times. "I've already told your people," Bobby said calmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had served him well as a sergeant in Vietnam. "I'm not interested in selling. This is my home." Thornton's smile never wavered, but Bobby caught something cold flickering behind his eyes. "I'm afraid you may not understand the situation, Mr. Martinez. The city has voted to approve our development project for this entire block. Your property falls within the designated area for eminent domain proceedings." The words hit Bobby like a physical blow. Eminent domain. He had heard about such things happening in other cities, but never imagined it could happen to him. The government taking private property for public good was one thing, but taking it to hand over to private developers felt fundamentally wrong. What kind of development? Bobby asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Weber finally looked up from his phone, showing slightly more interest in the conversation. Luxury condominiums and retail space. The project will bring significant tax revenue to the city and provide much-needed housing for young professionals. Bobby glanced around his neighborhood, taking in the modest homes where families had lived for generations, the small gardens where elderly residents grew vegetables, and the tree-lined street where children still played. What about the people who live here now? Relocation assistance will be provided, Thornton said smoothly, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase. We're prepared to offer you fair market value for your property, plus moving expenses and help finding suitable alternative housing. Fair market value. Bobby knew what that meant. They would offer him enough to buy a small apartment in a less desirable part of town, far from everything familiar, surrounded by strangers. At 73, starting over seemed impossible. And if I refuse? Bobby asked, though he was beginning to understand that this was not really a negotiation. Thornton's smile finally faded. The eminent domain process will proceed with or without your cooperation, Mr. Martinez. However, cooperation would make things much easier for everyone involved. You have 30 days to consider our offer. After the men left, Bobby sat alone on his porch for a long time, watching the city workers continue their preparations at the end of the street. The morning that had started so peacefully now felt like the beginning of the end of everything he had worked to preserve. He thought about calling his nephew Carlos, a lawyer who lived 2 states away, but pride held him back. He had always handled his own problems, and asking for help felt like admitting defeat before the battle had even begun. As the day wore on, Bobby noticed other residents emerging from their homes with confused and worried expressions. Mrs. Henderson was standing in her yard, clutching a similar folder to the one Thornton had left with him. The Johnsons across the street were having what appeared to be a heated discussion on their front lawn. Word was spreading quickly through the neighborhood that their quiet lives were about to be disrupted forever. That evening, Bobby called the only person he felt comfortable talking to about serious matters, Father Miguel from St. Anthony's Church, where Bobby had attended Mass every Sunday for the past 15 years. The priest listened patiently as Bobby explained the situation, offering words of comfort and practical advice about seeking legal counsel. You know, Bobby, Father Miguel said thoughtfully, sometimes David has to face Goliath. The question is not whether you're big enough to win, but whether you're brave enough to stand up for what's right. After hanging up the phone, Bobby sat in his living room, surrounded by photographs of his late wife and mementos from his military service. The Bronze Star he had earned for heroism under fire sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, alongside his Purple Heart and the folded flag from his wife's funeral. He had faced enemy fire in the jungles of Southeast Asia and watched good men die for principles they believed in. Surely he could find the courage to fight for his own home. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Bobby was watering the small garden his wife had planted when a young woman approached his fence. She introduced herself as Sarah Chun, a reporter for the local newspaper, and explained that she was investigating the development project and its impact on longtime residents. Mr. Martinez, she said, pulling out a notebook, I understand you're one of the property owners who received notice about the eminent domain proceedings. Would you be willing to share your story? Bobby hesitated. He had never been comfortable with publicity, preferring to handle his affairs privately. But something about Sarah's earnest expression and genuine interest convinced him to invite her inside for coffee. As they sat in his modest living room, Bobby found himself telling her not just about the development project, but about his life in the neighborhood, his service in Vietnam, and what the house meant to him. Sarah listened intently, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that showed she understood the deeper issues at stake. This isn't just about one old man's house, Bobby said finally. It's about whether communities have any say in their own future, or if money and political connections are the only things that matter anymore. Sarah nodded, making notes. Have you considered organizing with your neighbors? Sometimes there's strength in numbers. The idea had occurred to Bobby, but he was not sure how to go about it. He had always been more comfortable following orders than giving them, more at ease with individual action than group leadership. Still, Sarah's suggestion planted a seed that would grow in the days to come. After the reporter left, Bobby spent the afternoon walking through his neighborhood, really looking at it for perhaps the first time in years. He saw the carefully tended gardens, the children's toys scattered in yards, the evidence of lives being lived and families being raised. This was not just a collection of houses to be bulldozed for profit. This was a community, and it was worth fighting for. As the sun set on another day in his battle to save his home, Bobby Martinez made a decision that would change everything. He would not go quietly into that good night. He would stand his ground, and if necessary, he would make his last stand right here on Maple Street, in the house where he had loved and lost and learned what it meant to truly live. Bobby Martinez spent the next week doing something he had not done since his early days in the Marine Corps, planning a campaign. He spread the city documents across his kitchen table, studying every detail of the eminent domain proceedings and the proposed development timeline. The legal language was dense and confusing, filled with terms like public benefit and just compensation, but Bobby was determined to understand exactly what he was up against. The more he read, the angrier he became. The development project would not just displace the residents of Maple Street, but would fundamentally change the character of the entire neighborhood. The proposed luxury condominiums would start at prices that working families could never afford, effectively pricing out everyone who currently called the area home. The retail spaces would cater to affluent newcomers, replacing the family-owned businesses that had served the community for decades. Most troubling of all, Bobby discovered that Pinnacle Development had close ties to several city council members. Campaign contribution records showed thousands of dollars flowing from the company to local politicians, and one council member's son worked as a project manager for Pinnacle. The whole arrangement reeked of the kind of corruption that Bobby had thought he left behind when he returned from overseas. On Thursday morning, Bobby decided to take action. He walked 3 blocks to the small office of Martinez Home Improvements, a construction business run by his distant cousin Miguel Martinez. Despite sharing a last name, the two men had only spoken a handful of times over the years, but family was family, and Bobby hoped Miguel might have insights into the development business that could prove useful. Miguel was surprised to see his older cousin walk through his door, covered in sawdust and carrying blueprints for a kitchen renovation. He listened carefully as Bobby explained the situation, his expression growing increasingly serious as the details emerged. "Bobby, this is bigger than just your street," Miguel said, setting down his coffee cup. "I've been hearing rumors about Pinnacle for months. They're planning to redevelop half the old neighborhood, and they're using political connections to fast-track the approvals. Some of my contractor friends have been blacklisted just for asking questions about their methods." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Miguel sharing what he knew about the development company's tactics and the city officials who seemed to be helping them. By the time Bobby left, he had a much clearer picture of what he was facing, and it was more daunting than he had imagined. That afternoon, Bobby did something that required all the courage he could muster. He knocked on every door on Maple Street. He had always been a private man, but the situation demanded action, and action required allies. He started with Mrs. Henderson next door, then worked his way systematically through the neighborhood, introducing himself to people he had only waved to for years. The conversations were awkward at first. Bobby was not naturally comfortable with public speaking, and many of his neighbors seemed surprised that the quiet old man from the corner house was suddenly taking such an active role. But as word spread about his willingness to organize resistance to the development project, people began to open up about their own fears and frustrations. Mrs. Henderson revealed that she had been caring for her disabled adult son for over 15 years, and the specialized medical facilities he needed were all within walking distance of their current home. Moving would be devastating for both of them. The Johnson family had invested their life savings in renovating their house just 2 years earlier, and the compensation being offered would not cover their financial losses. An elderly widower named Frank Kowalski explained that his late wife was buried in the cemetery just 6 blocks away, and he visited her grave every morning as part of his daily walk. By Friday evening, Bobby had spoken with residents from 18 of the 22 houses on Maple Street. 15 families were facing eminent domain proceedings, while the others had already sold to Pinnacle under pressure. The stories were heartbreakingly similar. Longtime residents being forced from homes they had spent decades improving, families being scattered to different parts of the city, elderly people facing the trauma of starting over in unfamiliar surroundings. The organizing meeting took place in Bobby's living room on Saturday morning. 12 residents crowded into the modest space, ranging in age from the Garcias, a young couple with twin babies, to Frank Kowalski, who at 81 was the oldest person on the street. The diversity of the group reflected the neighborhood's character. Working-class families, retirees, small business owners, and city employees who had chosen to live in a community they could afford. Bobby had never chaired a meeting before, but his military experience had taught him the importance of clear communication and defined objectives. He started by asking each person to explain their situation and what they hoped to accomplish. The stories were powerful, and Bobby could see that sharing their experiences was already helping people feel less alone in their struggle. "We need to understand something," Bobby said when everyone had spoken. "This is not just about saving our houses. This is about whether ordinary people have any rights when politicians and developers decide they want what we have. If we don't stand up now, this will happen to other neighborhoods, other families, other communities." The group spent 2 hours discussing their options. Someone suggested hiring a lawyer, but the cost would be prohibitive for most of the residents. Another person proposed appealing to the city council, though several members had already shown their allegiance to Pinnacle Development. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that her nephew worked for the local television station and might be interested in covering their story. As the meeting was winding down, Frank Kowalski raised his hand. The old Polish immigrant had been quiet for most of the discussion, but now he spoke with the authority of someone who had seen history repeat itself too many times. "You young people," he said, his accent still thick after 60 years in America, "you think this is a new problem. But I tell you something. In old country, when government and rich people decide they want what poor people have, poor people must stick together or they lose everything. Bobby here, he knows about fighting. Maybe time we learn from him." The words hung in the air as the meeting broke up, but Bobby could see that Frank's speech had affected everyone. As people filed out of his house, several stopped to shake his hand and express their support for whatever action he decided to take. For the first time since receiving that first visit from Pinnacle Development, Bobby felt like he was not facing this fight alone. Sunday morning brought an unwelcome surprise. Bobby was returning from early Mass when he noticed a city inspector's vehicle parked in front of his house. A man in a uniform was taking photographs of his property and making notes on a clipboard. When Bobby approached, the inspector introduced himself as Tom Bradley from the Municipal Code Enforcement Office. "Mr. Martinez," Bradley said, consulting his clipboard, "I need to inform you that we've received complaints about code violations on your property. I'm required to conduct an inspection and file a report." Bobby felt his blood pressure rising, but he kept his voice level. "What kind of violations?" Bradley walked around the property, pointing out issues that Bobby had never heard mentioned in 20 years of living there. The front steps had structural concerns because of the way they creaked. The paint on the trim was deteriorating in a way that apparently violated city standards. The small garden shed in his backyard was improperly positioned relative to the property line. "I'll need access to inspect the interior as well," Bradley continued, "to check for electrical and plumbing code compliance." Bobby recognized what was happening. This was not a routine inspection triggered by neighbor complaints. This was intimidation, pure and simple. Someone was trying to create legal problems that would make his resistance to the eminent domain proceedings more difficult. "Do you have a warrant?" Bobby asked. Bradley looked uncomfortable. "Well, no. But if you refuse to allow the inspection, I'll have to report that as well. And it could complicate your situation with the development proceedings." "Then I guess you'll have to report it," Bobby said calmly. "Come back with proper paperwork if you need to inspect my house." After Bradley left, Bobby sat on his front porch and tried to process what had just happened. The pressure was escalating faster than he had expected. Pinnacle Development and their allies in city government were not content to wait for the legal proceedings to run their course. They were actively working to make life difficult for anyone who resisted their plans. The realization was both frightening and clarifying. This was not just a business dispute or a legal proceeding. This was a battle for the fundamental principle that people should have some control over their own lives and communities. Bobby had not asked for this fight, but running away was not in his nature. That afternoon, Bobby called Sarah Chun, the newspaper reporter who had interviewed him the previous week. He explained about the suspicious code inspection and asked if she thought it was worth investigating. Sarah was immediately interested and asked if she could come over to document the alleged violations that Bradley had cited. When Sarah arrived with a photographer, she spent over an hour examining Bobby's property and comparing the inspector's complaints with actual city code requirements. Her investigation revealed what Bobby had suspected. Most of the cited violations were either bogus or applied inconsistently throughout the neighborhood. Houses belonging to residents who had already sold to Pinnacle had similar or worse conditions, but had never been inspected. "This is a pattern," Sarah explained as they sat in Bobby's kitchen. "I've been researching other Pinnacle development projects, and they use the same tactics everywhere. Code enforcement harassment, expedited legal proceedings, political pressure. They're very good at making resistance seem futile." Bobby poured more coffee and considered his options. What would it take to stop them? Sarah thought carefully before answering. "You need legal representation, media coverage, and political support. But most importantly, you need to create enough public pressure that the city council finds it easier to side with residents than with developers. That means making this story about more than just property rights. You need to make it about the kind of community people want to live in." As the sun set on another day in his increasingly complicated life, Bobby Martinez realized that he was no longer just fighting for his house. He was fighting for an idea that seemed to be disappearing from American life. The notion that ordinary people deserved a voice in decisions that affected their communities. It was a battle worthy of an old Marine, even if victory seemed unlikely. The war for Maple Street was just beginning, and Bobby intended to fight it with everything he had learned about courage, determination, and the bonds that held communities together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he was ready for whatever came next. The first sign that Bobby's quiet resistance was growing into something larger came on Tuesday morning when he found 3 news vans parked on Maple Street. Sarah Chin's article had been published the previous day, and the story of an elderly veteran fighting eminent domain abuse had attracted attention from television stations and radio programs across the region. Bobby watched from his front window as reporters set up cameras and interviewed neighbors. He felt uncomfortable with the publicity, but he understood that media coverage might be their only weapon against Pinnacle Development's political connections. When a young reporter from Channel 7 knocked on his door, Bobby agreed to an interview despite his natural reluctance to be on television. The interview went better than Bobby had expected. The reporter, Maria Santos, asked thoughtful questions about his military service, his connection to the neighborhood, and his concerns about the development project. When she asked what he hoped to accomplish, Bobby found himself speaking with a clarity that surprised him. "This is not about one old man who does not want to move," Bobby said, looking directly into the camera. "This is about whether we still believe in America's promise that hard work and following the rules means something. These people want to take our homes not because they need them for a real public purpose, but because they can make more money if they tear down our neighborhood and build something for rich people instead." The interview aired during the evening news, and Bobby's phone started ringing immediately afterward. Some callers were supportive, offering donations for legal fees and expressing admiration for his willingness to fight. Others were critical, telling him to take the money and move on, or accusing him of standing in the way of progress. More importantly, the television coverage brought Bobby to the attention of people with resources and experience in fighting similar battles. Wednesday morning brought a call from attorney Linda Vasquez, who specialized in eminent domain cases and had seen a news story. She offered to represent Bobby and the other Maple Street residents on a reduced fee basis, with payment contingent on achieving a successful outcome. Linda met with Bobby and several neighbors that afternoon, spreading legal documents across his kitchen table and explaining the complexities of eminent domain law. The good news was that recent court decisions had made it harder for cities to take private property for projects that primarily benefited private developers. The bad news was that Pinnacle Development had structured their project carefully to meet the legal requirements for public benefit, including provisions for affordable housing and public green space. The key, Linda explained, is proving that the public benefit claims are fraudulent. If we can show that the affordable housing will never be built or that the public spaces will be effectively private, we might be able to challenge the entire project in court. The legal strategy would require extensive investigation and documentation, work that would take months and cost thousands of dollars even with Linda's reduced fees. Bobby felt overwhelmed by the complexity and expense, but he was encouraged by the knowledge that they had a real attorney willing to take on their case. Thursday brought an escalation that Bobby had not anticipated. He was working in his garden when 3 police cars pulled up in front of his house. 6 officers emerged, including one with a large German shepherd on a leash. The dog was clearly trained for law enforcement work, alert, and focused in a way that made Bobby immediately uncomfortable. The lead officer, a sergeant named Williams, approached Bobby with an official-looking document. "Mr. Martinez, I have a warrant to search your property based on reports of suspicious activity and potential code violations that may pose a public safety risk." Bobby read the warrant carefully, noting that it was signed by the same judge who had approved the eminent domain proceedings. The document was vague about the specific suspicious activity, mentioning only reports from concerned citizens and potential safety hazards requiring immediate investigation. "What kind of suspicious activity?" Bobby asked, though he suspected this was another form of harassment designed to intimidate him into accepting Pinnacle's offer. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details of an ongoing investigation," Williams replied. "We need you to step aside while we conduct our search." Bobby had no choice but to comply, but he called Linda Vasquez immediately to inform her about the search. She advised him to document everything and remain calm, regardless of what the officers might find or claim to find. The search lasted 2 hours and was clearly designed to be as disruptive as possible. Officers went through every room in Bobby's house, photographing items and making notes. They paid particular attention to his military memorabilia, spending considerable time examining his service medals and the small collection of military books and manuals he had kept from his time in Vietnam. The K-9 unit focused on his basement and garage, areas where the dog's handler claimed to detect suspicious odors that required further investigation. Bobby watched in growing anger as they moved boxes and furniture, disrupting the careful organization that his wife had established and he had maintained since her death. When the search concluded, Williams informed Bobby that while they had not found anything illegal, the investigation was ongoing and he should expect further contact from law enforcement. The implied message was clear. Continued resistance to the development project would bring continued scrutiny from police. As the officers were leaving, Bobby noticed Mrs. Henderson watching from her window with obvious distress. The elderly woman had lived through the civil rights era and understood how police harassment could be used to intimidate people who were fighting for their rights. Her expression of sympathy and support gave Bobby strength to resist the despair that was threatening to overwhelm him. That evening, Bobby's living room filled with neighbors who had heard about the police search through the neighborhood grapevine. The mood was tense, with several residents expressing fear that they might face similar treatment if they continued to support Bobby's resistance efforts. "This is exactly what they want," said Miguel Garcia, whose wife was holding their sleeping baby daughter. "They want us scared, fighting among ourselves, ready to take whatever they offer just to make the harassment stop." Frank Kowalski, the elderly Polish immigrant, spoke up from his corner chair. "In old country, When police come to search house of person who speaks against government, everyone knows what this means. But in America, police work for people, not for rich developers. We must remember this. Mrs. Henderson had brought her adult son Robert, who rarely left their house due to his disabilities but wanted to support Bobby's efforts. Robert had limited verbal skills, but he managed to convey his appreciation for Bobby's willingness to fight for the neighborhood where he had lived his entire adult life. The gathering became an impromptu strategy session, with residents sharing information about their own encounters with city officials and discussing ways to support each other. Someone suggested that they should document any harassment or unusual official attention, creating a record that might be useful in court proceedings. Bobby found himself reluctantly accepting the role of leader that circumstances had thrust upon him. He organized phone trees to keep everyone informed of developments, assigned people to research city council meeting procedures, and established a fund for legal expenses that several neighbors contributed to immediately. Friday morning brought unexpected reinforcement in the form of Tommy Chun, Sarah's husband, and a veteran of the Iraq War who had heard about Bobby's situation through his wife's reporting. Tommy was 30 years younger than Bobby and had served in a different war, but he understood the bond that connected all veterans regardless of when or where they had served. "Sir," Tommy said, standing respectfully on Bobby's front porch in a way that immediately identified him as former military, "I wanted to offer my assistance with whatever you might need. What they're doing to you and your neighbors is not right, and veterans need to stick together." The conversation that followed revealed that Tommy had experience with community organizing through his work with veterans advocacy groups. He offered to help Bobby navigate the political aspects of their fight, including preparing for city council meetings and coordinating with other neighborhood organizations that might support their cause. More importantly, Tommy brought news that Bobby's story was spreading beyond the local area. Veterans organizations in neighboring counties had heard about the situation and were offering support. A regional group that fought eminent domain abuse was planning to send legal observers to monitor future city proceedings related to the Maple Street development. By Friday evening, what had started as one old man's refusal to sell his house had evolved into a community movement with legal representation, media attention, and growing political support. Bobby felt simultaneously grateful for the help and overwhelmed by the responsibility of representing so many people's hopes and fears. As he prepared for another restless night, Bobby reflected on how much his life had changed in just 2 weeks. He had gone from quiet retirement to reluctant activism, from private grief to public leadership, from fighting alone to standing at the center of a growing coalition of people who believe that communities should have a voice in their own future. The battle for Maple Street was far from over, but Bobby was no longer fighting it alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new allies, and that made all the difference in a war that was about much more than houses and development projects. It was about the kind of country America aspired to be and whether ordinary people still had any power to shape that aspiration. The city council meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and Bobby spent the week preparing for what would likely be his most important public appearance since returning from Vietnam. Linda Vasquez had coached him on how to present his case effectively, emphasizing the need to focus on legal issues rather than emotional appeals, though she acknowledged that the human story behind the legal arguments was equally important. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected development that changed everything. Bobby was reviewing his notes for the council meeting when Tommy Chun arrived with urgent news. Through his connections with veterans organizations, Tommy had learned that several active-duty Marines from the nearby Camp Pendleton had heard about Bobby's situation and wanted to show their support. "Sir, they're planning to attend the city council meeting tomorrow," Tommy explained, clearly excited about this development. "These are young Marines who understand that when you fight for your country should fight for you when you need help." Bobby felt a mix of gratitude and concern about this news. While he appreciated the support, he was worried about the potential for the situation to escalate in ways that might hurt their cause. Military personnel attending political meetings could be perceived as intimidation, regardless of their intentions. How many Marines are we talking about? Bobby asked. About 20 so far, but word is spreading. These guys take care of their own, and they consider you one of their own, even though you served in a different era. That evening, Bobby called his nephew Carlos, the lawyer who lived 2 states away. He explained the situation and asked for advice about how to handle the growing support while avoiding any appearance of impropriety or intimidation. Uncle Bobby, Carlos said thoughtfully, you can't control who shows up to a public meeting, and you certainly can't tell Marines not to exercise their rights as citizens. But you can make sure your message stays focused on the legal and community issues, not on military service or veteran status. The advice was sound, but Bobby remained concerned about how the media and city officials might portray the presence of active duty military personnel at what was essentially a land use dispute. He spent a restless night considering various scenarios and how he might respond to them. Thursday morning brought news that vindicated Bobby's concerns about media manipulation. The local morning radio show featured an interview with David Thornton from Pinnacle Development, who suggested that Bobby was using his military connections to intimidate city officials and honest business people. We respect Mr. Martinez's service to our country, Thornton said smoothly, but military service doesn't give anyone the right to block legitimate development projects that will benefit the entire community. We hope that tonight's meeting will focus on facts and legal requirements, not on emotional appeals or displays of force. Bobby was furious at the implication that his resistance was somehow un-American or that seeking support from fellow veterans constituted a threat. But Linda Vasquez counseled patience, pointing out that Thornton's comments revealed nervousness about the growing support for Bobby's cause. He wouldn't be trying to undermine your credibility if he wasn't worried about losing, she said. That suggests we're having an impact. The city council chambers were packed by the time Bobby arrived Thursday evening. He was overwhelmed by the sight of more than 200 people crowded into a space designed for perhaps half that number. Residents from Maple Street sat in the front rows, but the audience also included people from other neighborhoods, veterans advocates, housing rights activists, and curious citizens who had followed the story in local media. True to Tommy's prediction, a substantial group of young Marines in dress uniforms occupied several rows near the back of the chamber. Their presence was respectful and silent, but unmistakably supportive. Bobby nodded acknowledgement to them as he made his way to the speaker's podium, feeling the weight of their expectations along with those of his neighbors. Mayor Patricia Williams called the meeting to order and announced that the eminent domain proceedings for the Maple Street Development Project were the evening's primary agenda item. She emphasized that the meeting was a formal legal proceeding and that all speakers would be limited to 3 minutes each. David Thornton spoke first, presenting a polished presentation complete with architectural renderings and economic impact projections. He emphasized the tax revenue the project would generate, the construction jobs it would create, and the modern housing it would provide for young professionals and families. This development represents responsible growth that will benefit our entire community, Thornton concluded. While we sympathize with residents who are reluctant to relocate, we cannot allow sentimentality to block progress that will serve the greater good. Linda Vasquez followed with a detailed legal presentation challenging the city's claim that the project met the requirements for eminent domain. She argued that taking private property to benefit a specific developer violated recent court decisions and constitutional principles, regardless of the claimed public benefits. The law requires that eminent domain serve a genuine public purpose, she explained. Transferring property from working-class homeowners to wealthy developers does not meet that standard, regardless of how the project is packaged or what promises are made about affordable housing that may never be built. When Bobby's turn came to speak, the chamber fell completely silent. He had prepared extensive notes, but standing at the podium, facing the council members who would decide his fate, he found himself speaking from the heart rather than from a script. My name is Robert Martinez, he began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. I served this country for 3 years in Vietnam, and I've lived on Maple Street for over 20 years. I'm not here tonight because I'm against progress or because I don't understand business. I'm here because what's happening to my neighborhood is wrong, and someone needs to say so. Bobby paused, looking around the chamber at the faces of people he had never seen before who had come to support his cause. When I was young, we were taught that America was special because ordinary people had rights that governments and wealthy interests couldn't just take away. We were taught that hard work and following the rules meant something, that if you paid your taxes and took care of your family and contributed to your community, you could expect to be treated with dignity and respect. The emotion in Bobby's voice was evident as he continued. I followed those rules my whole life. I served when my country asked me to serve. I worked 40 years in a factory after I came home. I've paid my taxes and taken care of my property and been a good neighbor. And now I'm being told that none of that matters because some developer with political connections wants to make money from my house. Bobby's 3 minutes were almost up, but he had one more point to make. This is bigger than my house or my street. This is about what kind of community we want to be. Do we want to be the kind of place where money and political connections are the only things that matter? Or do we want to be the kind of place where people's rights mean something, where communities have a voice in their own future? The applause that followed Bobby's speech was sustained and enthusiastic, but it was interrupted by an unexpected disruption. Councilman Robert Hayes, who had received substantial campaign contributions from Pinnacle Development, banged his gavel and called for order. "Mr. Martinez," Hayes said coldly, "while we appreciate your service, this is a legal proceeding, not a political rally. The emotional appeals and obvious attempts at intimidation will not influence this council's decision, which must be based on law and sound municipal policy." The reference to intimidation clearly alluded to the presence of the Marines, and Bobby felt his anger rising. But before he could respond, something unexpected happened. One of the young Marines stood up in the back of the chamber, came to attention, and saluted Bobby. Within seconds, every other Marine in the chamber had followed suit, standing in silent tribute to the veteran who was fighting for his community. The gesture was respectful and non-threatening, but it sent a powerful message about the support Bobby had earned. More importantly, it highlighted the contrast between the young serviceman showing respect for a veteran and the politician who had dismissed Bobby's concerns and implied that seeking support was somehow improper. Mayor Williams quickly called for a recess, clearly concerned about how the situation might develop. During the 15-minute break, Bobby was approached by dozens of people offering support and encouragement. Several other neighborhood representatives spoke briefly about similar threats their communities were facing, and it became clear that the Maple Street situation was part of a larger pattern of developer-friendly policies that were displacing longtime residents throughout the city. When the meeting resumed, the council voted to postpone their decision pending further legal review of the eminent domain petition. While this was not the victory Bobby had hoped for, it represented a delay that would give his legal team more time to build their case and organize political pressure. As people filed out of the chamber, Bobby was approached by Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, one of the Marines who had attended the meeting. She explained that she and her colleagues had grown up in communities similar to Maple Street, and they understood what was at stake in Bobby's fight. "Sir," she said with the same respectful tone Tommy Chun had used, "we wanted you to know that you're not fighting this battle alone. What you're doing takes real courage, and we respect that." The drive home that night was quiet, with Bobby reflecting on how much his life had changed since this battle began. He had never wanted to be a public figure or community leader, but circumstances had forced him into a role he was still learning to fill. The support he had received was overwhelming and humbling, but it also represented a responsibility that sometimes felt heavier than the burden of fighting for his own home. As he pulled into his driveway, Bobby noticed that someone had left flowers on his front porch, along with a note from a neighbor he had never met expressing gratitude for his willingness to stand up to powerful interests. Such gestures had become common over the past week, reminders that his fight had resonated with people far beyond Maple Street. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new developments in a battle that was far from over. But tonight, Bobby Martinez could go to sleep knowing that he had found his voice, his community had found its strength, and their cause had attracted allies they had never expected. The war for Maple Street was entering a new phase, and for the first time since this all began, victory seemed possible. The postponement of the city council decision had given Bobby's legal team 3 additional weeks to build their case, but it had also allowed Pinnacle Development to intensify their pressure campaign. Monday morning brought news that would test everyone's resolve in ways they had not anticipated. Bobby was having coffee with Tommy Chun and planning their next steps when Linda Vasquez called with disturbing information. Her investigation into Pinnacle's other project had uncovered evidence of systematic fraud in their affordable housing promises. In 3 previous developments, the company had received public subsidies and tax breaks by promising to include low-income housing, then found legal loopholes to avoid those commitments after construction was completed. This is exactly what we need to challenge their public benefit claims, Linda explained during an emergency meeting that afternoon. But gathering the documentation and preparing the legal filings will require resources we don't currently have. The legal fees were mounting faster than the neighborhood fund could cover them, and Bobby was facing a difficult decision about whether to mortgage his house to continue the fight. At 73, taking on debt that might take decades to repay seemed foolish, but giving up felt like betraying everyone who had supported his cause. The decision was made for him Tuesday morning when he received an unexpected call from Colonel James Patterson, the commanding officer at Camp Pendleton. The colonel explained that Bobby's story had reached the highest levels of Marine Corps leadership and that the Marine Corps Community Foundation wanted to contribute to his legal defense fund. Mr. Martinez, Colonel Patterson said, the Marines who attended that city council meeting did so as private citizens, but their respect for your service reflects values that are central to our Corps. We take care of our own, regardless of when they served. The Foundation's contribution, combined with donations from veterans organizations across the region, gave Linda Vasquez the resources she needed to mount a comprehensive legal challenge. More importantly, it sent a message to city officials and Pinnacle Development that Bobby's fight had attracted powerful allies who were not easily intimidated. Wednesday brought the confrontation that everyone had been expecting but hoping to avoid. Bobby was working his garden when a convoy of vehicles pulled up on Maple Street. Police cars, city inspection trucks, and a large van marked Animal Control. The show of force was clearly designed to intimidate residents and create the impression that dangerous criminals lived in the neighborhood. This time, the lead officer was Captain Morrison, the police department's highest-ranking official below the chief. He carried multiple warrants and was accompanied by the same K-9 unit that had searched Bobby's property weeks earlier. The German Shepherd seemed more agitated than before, possibly reflecting the tension of its handlers. Mr. Martinez, Morrison announced loudly enough for neighbors to hear, we have warrants to search multiple properties on this street based on reports of drug activity and illegal weapons. We need all residents to remain in their homes while we conduct our operations. Bobby immediately recognized this as the escalation he had been dreading. Someone was using police resources to harass and intimidate residents who had not backed down from their resistance to the development project. The timing, just days before the rescheduled city council meeting, was clearly not coincidental. Can I see the warrants? Bobby asked, though he knew his legal rights were limited once police operations were underway. Morrison handed him a thick stack of papers that would take hours to review properly. The warrants appeared to be based on anonymous tips about suspicious activity, vague enough to justify broad searches, but specific enough to satisfy legal requirements. Bobby noticed that every house scheduled for search belonged to residents who had spoken publicly against the development project. As police teams spread out across the neighborhood, Bobby called Linda Vasquez to inform her about the operations. She advised him to document everything and instructed neighbors to remain calm and cooperative while clearly stating that they did not consent to any searches beyond what the warrant specifically authorized. The searches continued for most of the day, with K-9 units focusing on areas where drugs or weapons might conceivably be hidden. Bobby watched from his front porch as officers disrupted the lives of people who had never had any contact with law enforcement beyond routine traffic stops. Mrs. Henderson was visibly distressed as strangers went through her late husband's belongings. The Garcia family's twin babies cried continuously as their home was systematically searched. By late afternoon, the police operations had found nothing more serious than a small amount of marijuana in one house, hardly justifying the massive deployment of resources. But the real purpose had been accomplished. Residents were frightened, exhausted, and angry. Several neighbors approached Bobby to express their intention to accept Pinnacle's offers and move away rather than endure more harassment. "I can't put my family through this," Miguel Garcia said as he held his crying daughter. "My wife is afraid to stay in the house alone now, and we can't live like this." Bobby understood the sentiment completely, but he also recognized that giving in to intimidation would only encourage more of the same tactics against other communities. The question was whether he had the right to ask his neighbors to continue fighting a battle that was taking such a personal toll on their families. That evening brought unexpected support from a source Bobby had never anticipated. Father Miguel from St. Anthony's Church arrived with a delegation of clergy members from other local congregations, representing Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish communities throughout the city. "Bobby," Father Miguel said as the group gathered in his living room, "what's happening here is about more than property rights. It's about justice and dignity and whether powerful people can use government authority to bully ordinary citizens. The faith community has a responsibility to speak out against such abuse." The clergy group had organized a prayer vigil for Friday evening, timed to occur just hours before the rescheduled city council meeting. They had also prepared a joint statement condemning the use of police harassment to intimidate residents who were exercising their legal rights to oppose development projects. More significantly, they had reached out to civil rights organizations that specialized in fighting government abuse of power. The ACLU had agreed to send legal observers to monitor the city council meeting and any future police activities in the neighborhood. Thursday morning brought news that shifted the entire dynamic of Bobby's fight. Sarah Chun called with information that her continued investigation had uncovered David Thornton and Pinnacle Development were under federal investigation for using fraudulent public benefit claims to obtain municipal subsidies in multiple cities. The FBI investigation had been ongoing for months, but Bobby's case had provided crucial evidence about Pinnacle's systematic pattern of deception. Federal agents wanted to interview Bobby and other Maple Street residents about their experiences with the company and city officials. "This changes everything," Linda Vasquez explained when Bobby called her with the news. "If federal prosecutors are building a corruption case against Pinnacle, the city council will be very reluctant to approve their eminent domain petition. No politician wants to be associated with a company that's under federal investigation." The prayer vigil Friday evening drew over 300 people to the small park adjacent to Maple Street. Bobby found himself deeply moved by the sight of people from different backgrounds and faith traditions coming together to support his community struggle. The ceremony was quiet and dignified, focused on principles of justice and community rather than specific political positions. Father Miguel's closing remarks captured the essence of what the fight had come to represent. "When we stand with our neighbors against injustice, we affirm the values that make communities strong. When we remain silent in the face of abuse of power, we become complicit in that abuse. Tonight, we choose to stand together." The rescheduled city council meeting Saturday morning was packed beyond capacity, with hundreds of people crowding into the chamber and overflow areas. The atmosphere was tense, but respectful, with Bobby supporters vastly outnumbering Pinnacle's representatives. Mayor Williams began the meeting by acknowledging that new information had come to light regarding the Maple Street development project. She announced that in light of the federal investigation into Pinnacle Development's business practices, the city would be suspending all proceedings related to eminent domain on Maple Street, pending the outcome of that investigation. The announcement triggered sustained applause from Bobby supporters, but he remained cautious until Linda Vasquez could explain the legal implications. During a brief recess, she confirmed that the suspension effectively killed Pinnacle's project, since their financing was contingent on acquiring the properties within a specific time frame. David Thornton's brief statement to the media outside the City Hall revealed his frustration and anger. He accused Bobby of using political connections and media manipulation to block a legitimate development project, and he suggested that the federal investigation was motivated by political considerations rather than genuine legal concerns. But Thornton's complaints rang hollow in the face of Bobby's obvious grassroots support and the evidence of fraud that had emerged from the investigation. More importantly, his confrontational tone contrasted sharply with Bobby's consistent focus on community values and legal principles. As Bobby walked home that afternoon, accompanied by neighbors and supporters who had become genuine friends over the past month, he reflected on how much had changed since that first morning when David Thornton had appeared on his porch with promises and threats. He had discovered reserves of courage and leadership that he had not known he possessed. He had learned that communities could fight back against abuse of power when people were willing to stand together. Most importantly, he had proven that ordinary citizens could still make a difference when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The victory was not complete. Pinnacle would likely appeal the decision and look for other ways to acquire the properties, but it represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The developers no longer had the advantage of surprise and political connections. They would now have to contend with an organized community backed by legal representation, media attention, and growing political support. As Bobby sat on his front porch that evening, watching children play in the street that would remain their neighborhood, he felt a satisfaction deeper than anything he had experienced since his wife's death. He had found a purpose worthy of the values that had sustained him through military service and civilian life. The house was still his, the neighborhood was still intact, and the community was stronger than ever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Bobby Martinez could rest in the knowledge that when his country and community needed him to serve again, he had answered the call with the same courage and determination that had defined his entire life. The Marines had taken control of the street, not through force or intimidation, but through the quiet strength of standing together for principles that mattered. It was a victory worthy of a uniform Bobby had worn with pride so many years ago, and a reminder that the values he had fought for overseas were still worth defending at home.